In episode 77, we left off talking about the death of Aurelian, a brutal, violent man, exactly the right man, to pull back together the Roman Empire, which had split into three different parts. As we'll see in today's episode, the aftermath of Aurelian's assassination was more crisis. Another 10 years of rapidly changing emperors, barbarian invasions, and internal strife. Aurelian's reunification was at best a band-aid. This is climate into which Diocletian, the visionary, low-born soldier, rose to become Roman emperor and inaugurate a system of government that had a bit of staying power, promoting both reunification but also regionalization at the same time. So, who was Diocletian and how did his plan to reshape the Roman Empire begin? We'll talk about that on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 78, Diocletian's Rise. It was late in AD 275. The Roman Empire was reeling because the emperor who had won the title Restitutor Orbis, or the Restorer of the World, was dead. For 5 years, he had been a violent force, pulling the empire back together through conquest, crushing the breakaway Palmyrene Empire in the east, led by Queen Zenobia, and also bringing the Gallic Empire in the west back into the fold. Aurelian, as we learned last time, had also fortified the city of Rome with a massive circuit of walls that are in many parts of the city still standing to this very day, and Aurelian also reformed the Roman monetary system, openly admitting that the coinage had been badly debased, minting coins that openly admitted this fact, and then enduring the rampant price inflation that followed. Unfortunately for Aurelian, he was a victim of his own strict discipline, overthrown by members of his government who were worried that their own failings would lead to their deaths. These officials turned on Aurelian, stabbed him to death, and the man who was supposed to be the empire's savior was dead and gone without an heir. Perhaps his wife ruled temporarily, but overall, there was chaos. Into the void following Aurelian's assassination leaped the Senate. They were eager to reclaim influence after years of enduring military strongman after military strongman and having basically no say in Roman politics. The Senate appointed a man named Marcus Claudius Tacitus, an older senator, probably over the age of 70, who had lived a quiet life on a country estate, no warrior, perhaps a retired general. Unfortunately, very little is known about him either way. He was almost certainly a kind of compromise candidate, chosen after army generals and members in the Senate had no doubt met to hash out some kind of agreement to avoid civil war. Unfortunately for Tacitus, in addition to having an unstable alliance backing him, he had to deal with the ongoing problems in the Roman Empire. Gothic raiders from the Black Sea continued to pillage Asia Minor and Greece. Cities like Galatia and Cilicia had fallen, and so Tacitus could not simply stay in Rome and try to resolve internal political tensions. He needed to lead a campaign personally to stop this invasion. And surprisingly, he halfway pulled it off. He scored a victory in Asia Minor that temporarily halted Gothic assaults, a rare win, especially for a Senate-backed emperor in the tumultuous 3rd century. But by June of 276, not even a year into his reign, Tacitus found his own troops turning on him while he was in the province of Cappadocia. Why? Well, we don't really know. The sources for this period are almost non-existent. The most reliable sources are coins, and they don't really tell us how people die or many of the details of military campaigns. We also have a literary source called the Augustan History, but as I've mentioned before on this podcast, much of that source has been verified as false, entirely made up later. And so what it says about Tacitus is difficult to trust. It sounds like Tacitus may have had some relatives in various governorships, including the current governor of Syria, which was nearby Cappadocia, and that man had been murdered by Roman soldiers during Tacitus's rule sometime in 276. Tacitus was nearby and may very well have sought justice on the murderers of his relative. And so in order to avoid punishment, the soldiers decided to kill Tacitus as well. That's one story. It may have also been more simpler than that he just died of old age or illness. Either way, Tacitus did not live long enough to establish any kind of stability, and the chaos that had been present in the 3rd century reared back again. Tacitus did not have an obvious heir. However, he did have a half-brother who was currently serving as Praetorian prefect. That is, the commander of the household guard of the emperor. His name was Florian. And perhaps because of his relationship to the now deceased Tacitus and also his powerful position as head of the Praetorian Guard, Florian simply declared himself emperor. He didn't ask for the Senate's approval. He really just needed the loyalty of Tacitus's army, which he gained right away. And so now Florian took over in 276. The problem is that there were other men that wanted to be in charge. So one of the commanders in the Eastern Roman Empire, and we don't know exactly where he was. This commander, his name was Probus, also declared himself to be emperor at the same time. And he also had several legions backing his claim. So we have 2 emperors, both with legions. What are they going to do? Of course, they are going to fight it out. That is the typical way of handling these things in the 3rd century. But Florian's soldiers were too impatient to do that. They decided on the way to the battle to defect and murder their commander. And so Florian would only be a usurper emperor for a month or two before he died. And now Probus was sole emperor at age 44, still in late 276. One advantage that Probus had over Florian was that Probus came from the Danube area, specifically from the city of Sirmium, which is in modern Serbia. This city was the capital of the Roman province of Pannonia Inferior, an area where many of Rome's soldiers were stationed, and so Probus was probably seen by many soldiers as one of their own. And while Florian had been the head of the Praetorian Guard and the half-brother of the previous emperor, he just simply did not have the kind of grassroots military background that was needed to lead at this point in Roman history. Roman soldiers wanted someone who would take them to war and win them glory and riches. And there was plenty of opportunity to do this. Franks, Alemanni, Goths were still hammering Roman borders in the north. So Probus took his soldiers, now united under his reign, to the Western Roman Empire and the Rhine River, where he spent 2 years fighting invaders, holding the river with a relentless series of campaigns. Probus was able to fortify the frontier, lend support to several of the cities in Gaul to help them build up their defenses, including defenses along the English Channel, what is sometimes called the Saxon Shore. And still to this day, Roman masonry survives in sites on both the English side and the French and Belgic side. Some of these were constructed under the reign of Probus. Now, why set up fortifications that are effectively internal fortifications? Rome reigns in Great Britain. It also reigns in Gaul. So why would they need to set up fortifications along the English Channel, which they in theory control? Well, that's exactly the problem. The Romans did not actually control the English Channel. They just controlled the land on either side of it. And Saxon pirates were able to move freely through the water and make opportunistic raids into either Gaul or Great Britain. In addition to adding forts along the Saxon shore, Probus had a larger vision to repair roads, drain swamps, plant vineyards, and he used soldiers to do these works. One of the reasons that Probus was able to fortify Rome's northern frontier was through the use of a settler program whereby he allowed invaders that promised to play nice, to recognize his rule, and to act as defensive bulwarks against non-allied tribes. Those newcomers were given land along Rome's borders, and the local Romans were told to look to these former invaders as their protection. It was a pragmatic fix for an empire that was increasingly impossible to defend. Naturally, while Probus was doing so much work in the west, the situation in the east gradually became tenuous. A man named Julius Saturninus over in Syria attempted to break away from the Roman Empire, and parts of Great Britain were also dealing with uprisings, even as Probus tried to make that island more secure. And probably realizing that things were beginning to fall apart, Probus decided to just declare victory. He marched towards Rome and celebrated a triumph in 281 AD, trying to suggest that not only had he unified the Roman Empire, but that he was rebuilding it and inaugurating a kind of golden age. And without the emperor's presence on the borders, discipline quickly began to break down. So Probus then marched to his hometown of Sirmium in Pannonia. There he put to work some of his soldiers on a drainage project. Now this was particularly unglamorous work, not building a fort, not improving roads, but slogging through the mud instead of fighting. And finally, the soldiers snapped. They were tired of doing degrading labor. They wanted to fight wars, and there were wars to be fought, and yet Probus was dorking around in Pannonia, and so the soldiers mutinied against their emperor and murdered him. Yet another emperor falling to the very men that he had led. At this point, control of the empire shifted back towards an elite, a man named Carus. Carus had been Praetorian prefect, and therefore no stranger to command, and Carus very smartly immediately made his two sons, Carinus and Numerian, his heirs, giving each of his sons the title of Caesar and establishing an immediate dynasty. Just like Probus, Carus also had to make a choice. Would he go and deal with the invading tribes in the west, or would he march east to deal with rebellions and also the looming threat of Persia? Well, Carus opted for glory, and so in 283 AD, he drove his soldiers east beyond Roman borders all the way into Sasanian Persia, sacking the capital city of Ctesiphon. We've heard this before. Numerous Roman emperors now had sacked that city. But of course, the problem that Carus faced is the problem that all emperors who did this faced. It's one thing to march into Persia. It's another thing to actually hold that territory. And unfortunately here, again, the sources have let us down. We don't know exactly what happened to Carus, only that he died. We don't know if he was defeated by the Sassanids. We don't know if he was murdered by a mutiny of his own troops. One source even claims that he was just simply struck by a lightning bolt. And quite frankly, he might as well have been, because we just don't know how he died. So he's just dead in 283. Now, the difference between this dead emperor and the last few is that Carus actually had successors in place with titles, and his two sons were in different parts of the empire. Carinus had been sent west, and Numerian was in the east with the remnant of Carus's invasion force. So let's start with Numerian, the younger of the two sons. Numerian was too young and too inexperienced to rule his own army. Instead, he relied on his wife's father, a man named Aper, and he was Numerian's Praetorian prefect. Not long after Numerian was named co-emperor with his brother, Aper almost certainly had him killed, probably with the intention of becoming emperor. However, instead of choosing Aper, the army picked one of their own members, a low-born soldier named Diocles, who had risen to become a sub-commander in the imperial bodyguard. And on November 20th of 284 AD, the soldiers of Numerian's former army hailed Diocles as emperor, and Diocles wasted no time dealing with his only potential rival, which was Aper. Diocles assembled the soldiers and accused Aper of murder in public, and with his own sword executed Aper before the assembled soldiers. It was swift, brutal justice. And the point was probably to silence any doubters in that army and to cement Diocles' authority as emperor. To add legitimacy to his claim, Diocles shed his low-born name and instead took on a Latinized name, Diocletian, which is what we will call him from now on. And now Diocletian, emperor in 284, would need to march to the west to defeat Carus's other son, who was older and more experienced, Carinus. Carinus and Diocletian would face off in 285 AD in the province of Moesia. And initially, Carinus' soldiers apparently held the advantage. The legions stayed true because, in part, Diocletian was an upstart and Carinus had been the heir, legitimately, of the previous emperor. But at some point during the battle, Carinus was killed by his own soldiers. Again, we don't know exactly what happened, and the stories are varied. Some say he was killed by an officer who was angry that Carinus had slept with his wife. Others, sources say that he just died in battle. We don't really know, but the point is Carinus died, ending the short-lived dynasty started by Probus, and now Diocletian stood alone as the sole emperor. And in some ways, Diocletian was just like any other 3rd century emperor. I already told you he was low-born, but his name Diocles is a common slave name at this time. It's unlikely that he himself had been a slave, but almost certainly his father was. So Diocletian was a man of the people, or more precisely, a man of the army. He probably owed everything that he had to his military career, and it was the only way of life that he knew. And so Diocletian would seek to remake the Roman Empire in the image of the military, with a stricter, clearer hierarchy, and with an economy and society that was ordered by command rather than law. And probably the other thing that Diocletian was aware of was that previous emperors had been unable to hold the Roman Empire on their own, and very quickly usurpers had declared themselves. So what did Diocletian do? Did he wait around for a usurpation? No. Instead, he took a revolutionary step just a year after he became emperor. He decided to name a fellow soldier, a man named Maximian, as his co-emperor. And Maximian would be in charge of taming the West, while Diocletian put affairs in order in the East. As far as we know, there was no family relationship between these two men. They were from the same region, the Roman province of Illyricum, but otherwise, there seems to have been no pre-existing relationship between them. Essentially, Diocletian decided to pick his main rival and co-emperor rather than just wait for somebody to declare war on him. But of course, to many in the Roman Empire, and probably to many soldiers, the idea of a kind of voluntary split of power like this was suspect at best. And there was the ongoing question of whether even two emperors were capable of taming the chaotic Roman Empire. Diocletian ultimately needed both a clever propaganda campaign to legitimize this divided system, but he also needed additional emperors to deal with all of the problems. So, what did Diocletian do to surmount the challenges in front of him? We will talk about that on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.